Swinburne University of Technology.
I'm here today for the PhD Hub with Associate Professor Kurt Seemann, who is the Director of the Centre for Design Innovation. I nearly said divine innovation. Maybe that's correct, because we live with design all of the time. We tend to take it for granted, and I think many of us in the Euro-Western world tend to see it as kind of an interior design motif, as some sort of pretty add-on. But of course it's basic to how we live our lives, how we walk, how we talk, how we live. And Kurt's research is in that whole area of design, technology and community, and how people interact with design and with the technology that's behind the design. And today we're talking about, or he's talking about, rigour in design research, the importance of design research, how he goes about it with his students and himself, and how it's a very rigorous academic and scholarly process. So perhaps you'd like to start to talk about, what do you say to your design PhD or postgraduate students about their research?
When you engage in design research, there are some similarities and differences to scientific research. I'm actually trained as a scientist. I used to work with CSIRO, but I'm also trained in design ethnography. So I can see where the methodology frame changes when you go into design and why it changes compared to staying in a strict scientific frame.
Right.
Both create knowledge, both test concepts, both are engaging with devices and sequencing. The question comes up of rigour in design research because it is not a well-known area when we think of research. We think of science most of the time when we think of research. Even social science, we think of research. What happens in design? Now, design is one of these things that's a bit like oxygen. It's around us, we're doing it all the time, and we're not aware of it.
Taking it very much for granted.
Taking it very much for granted. We just think, oh, we'll do the heavy research in science or in another discipline, and the impact area, the making it work bit, someone will just fix that up. Right?
They'll just apply it,
yeah.
And it'll just be there.
Just tell them it needs to have this feature and they'll design it.
Yes,
you know?
Yes.
The designers these days are starting to ask serious questions. Hang on, why do you think that's the case? And so they need frames, and we're building rapidly in the design field more rigorous frames which you can validate outside your ideology, if you like. You have an alternative ideology testing it, is probably another way of looking at it. So when I get a person who wants to do a design PhD, we're looking at we're often talking about where is the impact we're aiming for, what's the, who is the beneficiary, what's the context in which it has to make a change, because designers want to create.
And in writing we look at the ideal audience.
Right.
Which sounds very similar.
That's right. Now, it's hard to show in an object, a system, a graphic, or a service design, it's hard to show the research behind the object, the system, the graphic, or the service design. But what you can do is write up what led you to this position.
So this is like a reflective journal in writing, is it? That as you're doing your project, you're writing up the issues and ideas that came about and what you did.
Yeah, there are various models,
yes.
and certainly a critically written journal is useful, and that is definitely one mode. And then there is the other mode, which some people refer to as the design sciences, and that's where you are going through your typical pattern of, background literature, positioning your research in the knowledge, identifying a theoretical framework and methodology range, picking your methods, going through either at that point a deep description of the design issue, because descriptive research is quite important in all fields. And alternative also testing ideas is another way, and then analysing it. So there is that rigorous pattern. But in design research, which is a bit different to the straight laboratory type research that you'd see in classical sciences, and here's a good example. Like if in a scientific research mode, let's imagine, to make it simple, the classic experimental environment where you've got a laboratory.
Yes.
First of all, conceptually, there's usually somewhere a thesis being contested.
That's right.
And there's usually a proposition or an assertion, like a hypothesis,
being put forward. And tested.
And tested. And what's important about that process is that there is a reason for a relationship between one or more variables being observed.
Yes.
And
or you set that reason up, or you discover
right.
that
you have that reason there. That's right. That's absolutely right. And the worst thing that can happen in that process is that
there's no connection.
Well, no, that's all right. If you show that there really isn't a connection, that's okay. But that you don't need your ideology to go back over it and see if it's the same for someone else, right? It's repeatable by another person. But clearly, a big negative in classical research is two big negatives that I want to highlight among a few that can happen in classical research is that you have a confounding variable, that you are allowing the messiness of the world to interact with your test and your experiment. You know, that there's data coming in that you're not paying attention to, that's messing up your results.
Doesn't fit.
Well, that you're not even aware is there for a start. You know,
well, this is supposed to be the worst thing. Not that you don't know, but that you don't know that you don't know.
Correct. That's right. So to stop that, most pure research in the laboratory sense tries to make it as very clinical as possible, to rule out other messy variables that come into the experiment, so it's just those things that you're measuring and nothing else.
Yes.
The other thing is that you don't want to do in clean research is to have, following the Karl Popper approach, you don't want to chase data to prove a position.
No.
You know, you want to set up your experimental or your testing circumstance so that you give every chance for your hypothesis to fail. All right.
But you also give every chance of producing data that will support that hypothesis.
Yes, so it can go either way.
But you're not skewing the data.
That's right. So in the classic scientific sense, you're setting yourself up so that you're trying to disprove often the null hypothesis.
Yes.
To give reason to suggest that the only logical solution for this result is what I'm proposing in my thesis, that this is the relationship case.
Yes.
Right. Now let's have a look at design research methodology and rigour. Designers want to create in the real world, okay? Whether it's graphic, objects, systems, services. They want to create in the real world. And one of the things that is a problem with the real world is that it's messy. And you then find yourself in this conundrum of when don't you pay attention to things? You know, if I'm designing for you, if I'm designing a chair for you, do I just design a chair? Or do I find out what your world is like where you want the chair to be used? And if I'm designing a chair from the point of view of no client, you're not in the picture, I'm just designing it as a concept, just to put it out there. And I don't even care if the audience in a gallery like it or not, because it's all about me, right?
Yeah.
There is that side of design too, and
I love it.
And I think
and that's a very creative and
it's a very creative
side of design,
it's a fine arts side,
yes.
and I think when you're going down that side of to me there's a way of looking at this as a kind of a fork in the road. In designing, you can go down the creative fine arts side. And you can go down the impact side, where you're trying to actually make a deliberate change.
Or you could even be a Dadaist and just design something like a fur cup and saucer.
Yeah, that's the fine arts, where you're just doing it for fun.
Yes, but it still has a very good purpose,
doesn't
it? It's alerting people to design.
Yes, but that's when you're starting to have, you're wanting to understand that people will get that.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Because there's no point if I was a Dadaist and no one got it. You know, then I said, it didn't work. They didn't get it. So let's accept that there are there's an enormously creative role for the fine arts.
And we're not really looking at that at the moment.
We're not really looking at that, but we accept that that's a powerful area in design.
Extremely powerful, and
Yes.
it often feeds and is the engine for this other design,
Yes,
this more applied design.
That's right. Now, if you go into designing for a purpose, for an impact, you then have to ask more different kind of questions that we had in the scientific laboratory context. You have to say, how big should my bubble of criteria be of what I'm going to look at to help me make a good design?
Right.
So I just design about you and your space where you want to design the chair, about you as a person, you as your anatomy for the chair, you and the context in which you want the chair to be used. Do you need the chair to work at a bench? Do you need the chair to relax in the lounge? They're going to be two different solutions. Do you want the chair to be outside in the weather or inside in a certain space? Then you can look at the bubble being bigger. Do you want the chair in a context where others will see it? Do you want the chair in a context where others will use it? So it's not just you sitting in it now, so I can't be too particular about your anatomy, but it has to at least include your anatomy, right? Do I want it to be something that a lot of people will buy? And I don't know how they're going to use it. Well, the bubble's getting bigger now, and I've got to add more and more fact. Do I want to add a price point? Does it have to be within a price point? Does it have to certain strength factors in certain features? Is there a degree of key other variables that makes the bubble bigger and bigger and bigger of everything I've got to include in my research and what I need to put into the design?
So these are the real world elements of
yes,
design.
Right. So they're messy,
and
they're messy, and
yes.
and no matter how big you put the bubble, I mean the idealist position is that you include everything. And then you'll never get it designed because there'll be an infinite number of factors you haven't yet discovered that you needed to put in your design. So the rigor here is to get to know chunking frames about understanding the context of use. You know, the most likely key factors to understand, and start with that and limit it to that, and then test it. Do prototyping, do participatory research, do in situ research, get people to work with a concept chair that's close to where you're going with your design with someone. There are methods that suggest that the designer holds knowledge and creates for you as the patient, as the client-patient sort of relationship. And then there are co-design, co-creation, participatory processes where we want people to join in the act of designing, but the designer should come with some technical knowledge that the receiver might not know, to help constrain it to an actual produced outcome.
So design is always connected to technology and industry and audience and use?
In the impact sense, yes, that's right.
So there are other senses where it's not?
That's right. Well, in the fine arts sense...
Well, we're not talking about the fine arts,
yeah, that would be other
too much fun
They're
altogether.
having too much fun. And that's one of the wonderful things about working in the field of design. All humans design,
yes.
And it's one of our traits. We actually design things. We design it when we play. It should be a fundamental quality in early childhood, designing and playing.
And the French postmodernists call this bricolage, making it up so that it suits one situation. It's not rubbish, but it just suits that situation. So I need a hook on the door, I need to make a bit of wire and make the hook. And so it's a bit of bricolage. Yes.
Now, if we look at the question of rigour, we're saying then there are ethical questions that are different between the laboratory scientific classical mode, and I'm just using that as an extreme example of science, because there are other forms of science, right?
We can offset that against the happy people designing for fun.
That's right. That's right. So if we contrast, there's ethical differences. For example, when an individual, you could be both a scientist and a designer at the same time in the one project. That's fine. You know, you can be a mathematician and musician in the same moment of the project. When you're working on the clean scientific extreme,
yes,
your ethical concerns of that domain tends to be about the rights and the safety and the concerns around collecting your information. The data collection ethics approvals process. How are you going about doing this research? who's involved, what's involved, is there an animal involved, is there danger involved, is there humane questions to be involved.
Are there ethical concerns about the materials?
There can be
And would that have to be in your ethics application that you're using?
Oh, well, let's just talk about the scientific side, right?
Okay.
If you're doing all that, you're talking about the process of collecting information is a big ethical question.
Yes.
Right. On the opposite side, if you can contrast with in situ design work, your ethical question is, how is my design going to impact on people when it's created? So over here, you're concerned about the ethical process of gathering the information and then you publish it. Over here, you're talking about the ethical questions of having made it.
Right.
And is the bridge going to collapse? I'm going to be actually held liable within the warranty period. Are people going to have their business fail because the design is not going to grab their interest? Is the chair going to collapse when you sit on it?
Will the materials burst into flame in front of a fire?
Exactly, right. So there's a future concern in ethics.
Yes.
In the rigour of design. Yeah. So when design researchers want to look at ethics, there's a rigour about the future implications. So have you taken steps to attempt to minimise that so that at least it shows you're trying?
That's really quite exciting though, isn't it? Because
Yes.
you're saying this is not just an inert object that I've written up or drawn up, but it actually is going to live somewhere.
Yes,
and
it'll have a half-life. It'll have relevance at the beginning, and then as the world changes, it becomes less relevant.
And entropy. Everything works towards its own destruction.
It does, and that's a really important concept in systemic thinking when it comes around. So that's on one side, the ethics question. On one side, when you're working in the scientific mode, you're going to go through ethics approval committees, which goes right up to publishing. But once you publish, you're not responsible.
That's right.
Now, you might feel responsible.
Well, thalidomide you probably felt responsible for.
But you're not held responsible
No.
for what people do with your findings, all right? And on your side, when you create, you are held responsible in many fields of design.
If the bridge collapses,
you're taken to
trouble.
court, yeah. So, and even if there's no legal process to chase you, people will know you created it.
And there's a moral and ethical dimension to it.
So there's a point of difference of the two. Designing has an ethical dimension towards the future and how it's changing things. And the classical laboratory research has an ethical dimension up to publication, but not held responsible for what people do with your findings.
So now, doesn't this terrify your design students? Don't they think, I better not build that bridge?
Well, look, that's right. And so that might make a better design,
Yes.
you know. So now the other thing is, while that's the case, both sides do have ethical positions. So, for example, if you're working in the scientific mode, you are likely to feel there are scientists who withhold findings because they are worried about how certain sectors of society with power might use it.
Yes.
So they don't publish. And there are people in the design side who refuse to do the design because they know where it could end up, understanding the consequences of future impact, right? So they, these days, an example would be that there are designers who won't design anything that doesn't have a strong sustainability feel to it, that it has low carbon footprint and so on, as a future consequence. Then there's another thing too. When we design on the scientific side, we're trying to control the variables so that we know that the results we're getting in the experiment are because of those variables we're measuring.
Yes.
Okay. But in the design side, we're trying to accommodate as many variables as we can.
So it's this big bubble you were talking about.
It's this bubble question.
How big can the bubble get?
Yeah.
And how can you focus? And for a postgraduate student, you must focus, of course.
That's right. So if you focus in postgraduate design research, if you focus too much, the design is not going to be too relevant.
So you've got to find
You've got to find the bubble. So the rigour is to put conceptual frames in place and experience to help you find when the bubble is big enough. And so there is an art there. But the art is not based on artiness, it's based on experience and literature.
And judgment.
And judgment. So one is trying to control the variables on the scientific side of that mode of working, And the other mode of working is to maximise the number of variables to get you the best impact when you design. And then ultimately it comes down to validation processes too. On the scientific side, we test a hypothesis fundamentally. We test a position. We explore it as well. And this is often brought out in the classic sense of Karl Popper's falsification theorem. But on the, what do you do on the design side to validate it so it's not just mere opinion, right? Well, what we do in the design side is you'll see a lot of design schools have things like a design defence.
Right.
They defend their design, but what are they defending against? Well, it goes back to our first things about what's in the bubble and what's out, and the reasons why we're packing it in, the reasons why we're packing it out as design criteria. So we defend on the basis of best fit to context and purpose.
Yes.
Right? So there's a frame there now to say, when you're in the mode of designing and you're creating new knowledge, you're designing for best fit and context. And that's right, and purpose. And if you are in the scientific mode, you're testing falsification processes. So any individual can jump between the two in their design projects. I might test a material.
Yes. But ultimately you're talking about best fit, context and purpose as it were the bottom line of everything that you're doing in design research.
Yes, and that in a nutshell, purpose and context analysis and finding best fit and future ethical concerns, they're pretty much the fundamental principles of rigorous design research.
Well, thank you, Kurt. That's a really interesting series of ideas about design research, but of course those kinds of ideas are very important for all research students to have a look at, to think about and to apply. So I'm sure they'll be useful to all of us in the PhD Hub. Thank you again.
Thank you.
This has been a Swinburne production.